40 minutes on the bank. You reel in to check the bait and there is nothing there. Clean steel. Maybe a strand of weed. Here is the question almost nobody asks in that moment. When did it come off? If it left on the cast, you just fished 40 minutes of empty water. If it dissolved 8 minutes in, 32 minutes of empty water, either way the spot was probably fine. The bait was gone. 15 baits today, all out of a normal kitchen, all ready to fish tonight. Nothing to mail order, nothing to wait 3 days for, nothing that needs a bait shop. 3 things to watch for. The most interesting thing in your refrigerator is not the liver, and most people pour it down the drain. The oldest rule in catfishing, the one about stink, has a hole in it nobody on the bank talks about. And number 1 is not the smelliest thing here, and not the most expensive. It earns the spot because it does 2 opposite jobs at once. Let me start with the cheapest thing in the house. Number 15. Plain white bread. Tear the soft middle out of a slice. Squeeze it between your palms until it stops being bread and starts being putty. Press it around a small treble. Complete bait costs about nothing. Here is the part that matters, and it is already in your hand. That slice is 2 different materials. The soft middle drinks water instantly and starts coming apart in seconds. The crust does the opposite. It holds far longer and lets go of very little. Same slice, 2 behaviors. That is the entire video in 1 piece of bread. Because every bait you will ever tie on is doing 2 jobs at once, and those 2 jobs fight each other. It has to let something out into the water, or nothing knows it is there. And it has to stay on the hook, or nothing gets a chance to eat it. Leak enough to be found. Hold long enough to be eaten. Write that down. We are coming back to it more than once. Soft middle when you are fishing close and checking often. Work crust in when you need it to survive a longer cast. Release tendency, fast. Hook durability, low. Best bet, a mixed bag. And still the best thing on this list to hand a kid. Optional upgrade. Day-old bread makes a tougher ball than fresh, but you do not have to wait for it. Before number 14, a tool, because you will use it on everything else here and it costs nothing. Clear glass, water from the tap or better from the lake you fish. Drop a finished bait in, hook and all, rigged the way you would cast it. Look at it at 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. 3 things to write down. How much bait is still on the hook, whether you can see anything leaving it, a cloud, a haze, a ring of oil, and whether it still has structure or has gone to mush. Now I have to be clear about what this is not, because this is where a lot of fishing content quietly cheats you. It tells you how a material behaves in water. That is all. A big cloud does not mean a catfish smells it from farther away. An oil slick is not proof of a scent trail. Surviving 10 minutes in a jar tells you nothing about whether a fish wants to eat it. What fish prefer is a different test entirely. Out on the water, same spot, same rig, swapping back and forth over several trips. We get to that one later. The glass tells you about the bait. The water tells you about the fish. Keep those apart and you are already outthinking most people on the bank. Number 14. Bread and peanut butter. Same bread, now work in a couple of spoons of cheap processed peanut butter. The kind with stabilizers, not the natural kind with oil floating on top. Knead until the color is even. Put that in a glass next to plain bread, and the difference jumps out. The peanut butter ball holds together far longer. It resists water instead of drinking it. And here is the first honest trade in this video. The fat that makes it hold is also sitting between the water and everything inside that ball. You made it tougher, and in doing that you very likely slowed down whatever was going to come out. Not a reason to skip it. A reason to know which one you are choosing. Close and still, plain bread is probably doing more work. Long cast, or walking away from the rod, the peanut butter version is the one still there when something shows up. Release tendency, medium. Hook durability, medium. Best bet, channel cats. Number 13. 1 slice of processed cheese. Peel it, roll it tight, press it on the hook. Now, everybody says you want the strongest smelling cheese you can find. Sharper, older, funkier, better. I want to push on that because it comes from thinking about your nose instead of the water. A lot of what makes an aged cheese hit you that hard is carried in fat. Underwater, the part that travels is the part that dissolves. Not the same list. Processed cheese is engineered to melt and blend. Put a cheap slice and a hard-aged wedge in 2 glasses and watch. They do not behave the same way at all. What I am not going to tell you is that the cheap slice catches more catfish. Nobody has shown me that. What I will tell you is that it actually goes into the water instead of sitting there as a lump of fat, and it costs 20 cents. Enough reason to try it first and let your water settle the argument. Release tendency, medium. Hook durability, medium. Best bet, channel cats. Cheese firms up cold and softens warm, so in a hot lake in August, roll it tighter than feels right. Number 12. The base dough. Flour, cornmeal, garlic powder, water. Mix the dry first. Add water a spoonful at a time until it holds together and stops sticking to your hands. 2 minutes and you have a bait. If you have watched anything about homemade bait, you have heard the 4-part formula. A base for bulk, a binder to hold it, an attractant for smell, a liquid for texture. Useful way to organize a kitchen, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. But it is missing the slot that decides your night. A bait is not a list of ingredients. A bait is a schedule. Not what is in it, how fast it comes out, and how long it stays on the hook while it does. So add a 5th slot and put it at the top. Release rate. Once you think that way, this dough stops being a recipe and turns into a set of dials. More cornmeal, stiffer and slower. More water, softer and faster. A little fat, holds better, slows down. And you turn 1 dial per trip. Turn 3 and you will never know which one did anything. Here is why that schedule matters more than people think. Researchers working with channel catfish and their close relatives found something that should change how you picture your bait down there in the dark. These fish can track a chemical back to its source using taste receptors spread across their whole body, comparing concentrations as they move, even with no current carrying a trail to them. In fishing terms, the fish is not waiting for a puff of smell to arrive. It is following a gradient, a slope, weaker to stronger, back to wherever it comes from. A slope takes time to build and time to climb. So what does that change on your hook tonight? The strongest smelling bait on earth is worth nothing if it dumped everything in the first 90 seconds and went quiet. You want something still leaking when a fish gets close enough to work up the slope. Leak enough to be found. Hold long enough to be eaten. Number 11. Hot dogs. Cut into 1/2-inch coins and thread one on through the flat side. Hot dogs get laughed at and they should not be. As a material, this is one of the better things in your refrigerator. A tight meat emulsion, salt and fat locked into protein, and it survives a hard cast, a long soak, and an afternoon of small fish picking at it. Drop one in the glass. 10 minutes later it is still a coin, almost exactly like it went in. And that is exactly the problem. Something that barely changes in 10 minutes of water is barely putting anything into that water. Hot dogs catch fish, mostly smaller channels. But they are a hold-first bait, and you should fish them knowing that instead of wondering why the rod is quiet. Release tendency, slow. Hook durability, high. Best bet, channel cats, numbers rather than size. Now let me put the whole problem in front of you in one shot, 2 glasses side by side. Left glass, a hot dog coin. Right glass, a spoon of cheap canned cat food pressed onto a treble. 2 minutes in, the hot dog looks untouched. The cat food is already a brown cloud and the hook is half bare. 10 minutes in, the hot dog is still a coin. The cat food is gone. 2 opposite baits, and fished carelessly both are a dead hook. The hot dog is still sitting there at hour 2, having announced almost nothing. The cat food announced itself as loudly as anything in your kitchen can, then stopped existing before your rod tip settled. One holds and does not leak. One leaks and does not hold. Neither one is a bait. Both are half a bait. Everything from here is about closing that gap, and by the end you are going to build something that does both jobs on purpose. If that framing is useful, a like helps this reach the next person standing in the bait aisle holding an $8 jar. That is the whole ask. Back to it. Number 10. Chicken skin and the fat you trim off the thighs. If you cook chicken at home, you throw this away. Stop. Cut it into strips about the width of your finger. Skin is mostly collagen, and collagen is tough. Thread a strip on, and it handles a long cast and a lot of abuse from bluegill and turtles. In the glass at 10 minutes, it is still a strip. But it earns its place as a foundation, not as a bait on its own. Wrap a strip around the shank first, then pack something soft around the outside. Now the soft stuff has something to grip, and when it washes away, you still have something on that hook instead of bare steel. That is a 2-layer bait. Hold on to it, because number 1 is built entirely out of it. Release tendency, slow. Hook durability, high. Number 9. Eggs, and this is 2 baits out of 1 carton. First one. Hard boil a couple. Take the whites, cut them into cubes. Firm, rubbery, bright white, hard for small fish to tear apart. Hook once through a corner so most of the cube hangs free. The second is why eggs are here at all. Crack a raw egg into your dough while mixing and use a little less water. Egg protein sets when it gets warm. So roll your balls, drop them into simmering water for about a minute, and they come out with a firm skin outside and a soft center still inside. You just built a bait with 2 speeds in it, using 1 egg and a pot of water, in 5 minutes. Release tendency. Slow at first, then faster once the skin gives. Hook durability. High. Best bet. Channel cats. Number 8. Shrimp out of the freezer or left over from dinner. Shrimp is here because it is the only bait on this list where you can see the dial and turn it with your fingers. Shell on, slow, and it holds. Peeled, soft, and it goes fast. Peel half and you land in between. Same shrimp, 3 baits, and you make the call at the water depending on how far you are casting. Most people peel it or they do not, and never think of it as a choice. Release tendency, your call. Hook durability, medium to high. Best bet, channel cats and blues. Optional upgrade if you have the night. Peeled shrimp under 3 parts plain salt to 1 part sugar, refrigerated overnight. Salt firms the meat, sugar keeps it from going all the way to rubber. But shrimp fishes straight out of the bag tonight. Number 7. Canned sardines or canned mackerel. Open the can. That fish was cooked in there, which makes it softer than any fresh-cut bait you have handled. Break off a chunk, and it falls apart in your fingers. In the glass, it clouds fast and comes off quickly. Not a knock. It tells you how to fish it. Short soak. Cast, 15 or 20 minutes. Reload. Fish the other way. Left out an hour because nothing bit. It is a bare hook and 45 wasted minutes, and you standing there blaming the lake. Release tendency. Fast. Hook durability. Low. Best bet. Blues and channels. And do not pour off the oil in that can. Set it aside. Number 6 is entirely about what to do with it. Number 6. Dough loaded with the oil out of the can. Take your base dough from number 12 and work a spoonful of that oil into it. It gets slick, so add cornmeal back until it behaves. Now a minute here, because this is where a very common idea goes sideways. You have heard that oil carries scent, that it rises through the water and builds a column of smell a fish crosses and follows down to you. Great sounding story. I have heard it my whole life. Here is the problem. The chemical cues a catfish is built to detect are the ones that dissolve in water. Oil is the opposite. Oil and water do not mix, which is exactly why you can see a slick sitting on the surface instead of spread through the lake. So what is oil really doing inside your bait? Not carrying anything out. If anything, it is in the way. Coating things, slowing water down, keeping the inside of that ball drier for longer, which means oil is genuinely useful, just not for the reason you were told. It is a break. It buys you time. That slick is doing a lot for your confidence. I would not count on it doing much for the fish. So what changes tonight? Stop adding oil to make a bait smell stronger. Start adding oil when you need it to last longer. 2 different problems, and you know which tool solves which. Release tendency, medium, slowed on purpose. Hook durability, high. All right. Now, the part I have been building toward, and this is the one thing here most experienced catfishermen have never had put to them this way. Every one of us has been told that stinkier is better. Let it sit, let it work, let it get ripe. The nastier it is, the bigger the fish. I want to take that apart, not to tell you it is wrong, but to show you that nobody actually knows where it stops. When meat sits, it goes through 2 chapters, and they are not the same chemistry at all. Chapter 1 is the tissue breaking itself down. Enzymes already inside that liver or that shrimp start cutting proteins into smaller pieces, and a lot of those pieces are small, water-soluble compounds a catfish is very well equipped to detect. That chapter is real, and it is probably where the old wisdom came from. Something that has sat a little while can genuinely have more dissolvable material in it than something cut 30 seconds ago. Chapter 2 is bacteria taking over, and bacteria do not politely stop where Chapter 1 ended. They keep going and turn those same compounds into something else again. This is where a thing stops smelling like food gone soft and starts smelling like something that died. You know the exact smell. Here is where it gets strange. Researchers looking at how fish respond to those late-stage decay compounds found something genuinely odd. In some species, those compounds set off a strong, built-in avoidance response. The fish does not investigate, it leaves. In other species, the very same compounds appear to work as a powerful attractant. Same molecules, opposite reactions, depending on which fish you ask. And I will be straight about the part that matters most. I do not have a study in front of me that ran that test on channel catfish, so I am not going to tell you rotten bait pushes catfish away, because nobody has shown me that it does. What I am telling you is narrower and more useful. Stinkier is not a scientific measurement. It is a feeling in your nose. And once that chemistry has crossed from Chapter 1 into Chapter 2, we do not have enough channel catfish evidence to pretend anybody knows exactly where better ends and worse begins. So here is how you find out on your own water, free, and more reliable than anything I could tell you from here. Make 1 batch, split it 3 ways. Jar A, fish it fresh today. Jar B, sealed, cold. Date on the lid, fished in a few days. Jar C, let it go well past anything you would normally use. All 3 to the same stretch of bank on the same night. Same depth, same rig, same hook size. 20 minutes each, then swap, and keep rotating so no jar gets the good water all night. Write down touches, hookups, size. 3 separate trips before you believe your own results, because one night proves nothing and you know it. Nobody sells that. There is no product on any shelf in America that is a notebook and 3 jars, and it will teach you more about your lake than every jar you have ever bought put together. Number 5. Unflavored gelatin. A box in the baking aisle for a couple of dollars, and the most underrated bait-making item in a grocery store. Make a strong-smelling liquid out of whatever you have. Juice from a can of fish. Water you rinsed liver in. Warm water with garlic powder stirred through. Warm it, stir the gelatin in until it dissolves, pour into an ice cube tray, refrigerate. An hour or 2 later you have firm cubes you thread straight on a hook. And now the part that makes it different from everything else here. Gelatin is temperature sensitive. A gelatin set is firm cold and softens as things warm up. Every other binder in your kitchen behaves about the same in April as in August. This one does not, which means you can aim it. Less gelatin for cold water, more for warm water, when everything is already coming apart faster than you want. Nobody sells a winter binder and a summer binder, because it is the same $2 box either way, and there is no second sale in it. Release tendency, whatever you set it to. Hook durability, medium to high. Number 4. Fresh chicken liver. Everybody knows liver works, so I am not going to sell you on it. I am going to fix it. Liver is the far end of one side of everything here, loaded with blood and the soluble material blood carries, and it dumps that into the water almost immediately. In a glass, it goes cloudy the second it hits, and it falls off. On the cast, when a bluegill breathes on it, and half the time you never knew it was gone. So here is the whole bonus section, and it applies to liver, cat food, canned fish, Every soft thing in this video. Cotton. Pull a cotton ball into wisps and fold it into your soft bait. The fibers tangle in the barbs of a treble and lock the whole thing in place. 2 cents. Mesh. A scrap of old pantyhose, a square from an onion bag, a piece of gauze. Spoon of soft bait in the middle, twist it closed, pin it on the hook. The bait survives everything and the water still gets in. A ballpoint pen spring. Pull one out of a dead pen, slide it up the shank, press your dough around it. That is a bait spring. They sell those. A cube of kitchen sponge. Soak it and thread it on. A carrier that never falls apart. And chicken skin from number 10 as the base layer under everything else. One real note. Anything synthetic comes back out of the water with your rig. Pin it properly. If you break off, that is litter you left behind. Liver, release tendency, fast. Hook durability, low on its own, high once you fix it. Best bet, channel cats. Optional upgrade, 3 parts salt to 1 part sugar, overnight in the refrigerator. It firms up and holds far better, but fresh liver in a mesh pouch works tonight, and tonight is the point. Number 3. This is the one I flagged in the first 30 seconds. Go look at the tray your chicken or your ground beef came home on. That liquid pooled underneath, the stuff everybody tips down the drain, is not blood. It is water and dissolved protein that came out of the meat. Dissolved is the word that matters, because dissolved is the only kind of thing that goes anywhere at all in a lake. By itself it is a liquid, and a liquid is not a bait. So build it into one. Pour it into a bowl. Stir in cornmeal a spoonful at a time until it thickens into a paste that clings to a spoon when you tip it sideways. If it drips, more cornmeal. If it crumbles, a splash of water. Rigged, fishable bait, 4 minutes. And the active part was free and already on its way to the sink. On a treble with a wisp of cotton worked in it holds, on a bare single hook it will not. You can also use the liquid straight as a dip. Keep some in a jar and dunk your hook bait before every cast. Release tendency, fast to medium depending how thick you build it. Hook durability, medium with fiber in it. Handling, and I will not be precious about it. This is raw meat liquid. Container and spoon that live in the garage, not the kitchen drawer. Keep it cold until you leave. Wash your hands. Number 2. Canned cat food, the smooth kind. You saw this one in the glass, so you know what it is. It comes apart fast and will not stay on anything by itself. For a long time I would have called that a bad bait. Not anymore. It is half a bait, and it is the half that is hardest to make out of anything else in your kitchen. Mesh pouch or a heavy wad of cotton, no exceptions. Short casts. Check every 15 minutes. Set it out and forget about it, and you are fishing bare steel by minute 10 without knowing. Release tendency, fast. Hook durability, very low on its own. Best bet, channel cats and blues. And notice something now that we are near the top. Almost every bait on this list is too much of one thing. Bread leaks and will not hold. Hot dogs hold and barely leak. Liver and cat food leak and vanish. Chicken skin holds and says almost nothing. 15 baits, and most of them are half of the answer. So let me show you what happens when you stop picking one and start building both. Number 1. And I want to frame this honestly, because the framing matters. This is not a bait I can tell you catches more fish than the other 14. Nobody has run that test, and I am not going to invent one. This is the bait I would build tonight if I had to use everything in this video and nothing else. I call it the 2-speed ball. 3 layers and you already have all 3. The core is your fastest, least durable material. A spoon of cat food, a lump of liver, the meat juice paste from number 3. Whatever comes apart quickest. Roll it into a ball about the size of a marble. The shell is your slow material. Base dough, heavy on the cornmeal, a little oil worked in, or a gelatin mix if you made one. Flatten it in your palm, wrap it around the core, seal the seam with your thumb, and the skeleton, in the middle, holding all of it to the hook. A strip of chicken skin around the shank, a wisp of cotton through the whole thing, or the entire ball inside a mesh pouch. Now think about what that does down there. The shell gives way slowly. Not a burst, a leak. And it keeps leaking because there is more of it than there strictly needs to be. That is your slope. That is the thing a fish can work its way back along instead of arriving late to a smell that already ended. And when the shell finally opens, the core is still in there, undisturbed. Right at the moment something is close enough for it to matter, the shell buys the time. The core spends it, and the skeleton keeps both attached to your hook while it happens. That is not a recipe. That is a design. And the reason it sits at number 1 is not that it is the smelliest thing here or the most expensive. It is that it is the only thing on this list that is not half of a bait. Leak enough to be found, hold long enough to be eaten. I am not going to read the 15 back to you. Here is what I want you walking away with. From tonight, when you open your refrigerator, you ask any ingredient 2 questions. Does it release? Does it hold? If it only releases, it needs a partner. Wrap it, pack it around something tough, or put mesh around it. If it only holds, it needs a source. Score it, cut into it, or pack something faster around the outside. If it does a little of both, you are close and just adjusting, wetter and softer to speed it up, more cornmeal, more fat, squeezed tighter to slow it down. A few situations worth carrying in your head. Still water, fishing close, checking often. Lean fast. Nothing out there is carrying your bait anywhere for you. Long cast or moving water. Lean hard toward hold. It does not matter what is inside a bait that came off on the cast. Sitting on a rod for an hour. Nothing in your kitchen leaks for an hour. You are betting on a fish coming past, so give it something still there when one does. Bait flying off the cast is a structure problem. Fiber, mesh, or a tougher base layer. Coming back bare after a soak is a release problem. Slow it down. And warm water speeds everything up, so build tighter in August than in April. 2 quick things. Bait and chumming rules differ by state and sometimes by individual water, so check your state and local regulations before you put anything unusual in the water. Handle raw meat, liver, and meat juice with gear that stays out of your kitchen. Keep it cold. Wash your hands. And anything synthetic you use to hold a bait comes home with your rig. Now I want a real argument out of at least one of these. First, I said stinkier is not a scientific measurement, and I know some of you have a jar that has been going 2 weeks and produces every time. If that is you, tell me how many days, what lake, what month. Prove me wrong with details, not with a feeling. Second, and this is the one I am genuinely curious about. When your bait fails, which way does it fail? Does it come off, or does it go quiet? Answer in one word, because I think most of us have spent years fixing the wrong half. Leak enough to be found. Hold long enough to be eaten. Now go build something.